Hi, and welcome to this show. My name is Christina Toledano Osbrink, and I'm here in Netanya with Barry Shaw. Could you, maybe you could introduce yourself, Barry?
My name is Barry Shaw. I'm living here in Netanya, over the cliff tops of the Mediterranean Sea, center of Israel. I'm the Senior Associate for Public Diplomacy at the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, and I'm on a mission giving people throughout the world the facts and the information they need to make an intelligent decision on their opinion of what's going on in the Middle East, and particularly Israel.
Okay. Now, so we're here in Netanya. The Mediterranean is just in front of us, and 16 kilometers behind us, to the east, is actually Palestine.
Exactly, outside my kitchen window.
Outside your kitchen window.
Yes.
So Palestine, that being Samaria, the Samarian mountains in this case? Yeah.
You have to realize when you see a map of Israel that Netanya is on the vulnerable Sharon Valley coastal plain stretching from Gedera, which is just south of Tel Aviv, up to Haifa, which is north of here. We're midway between Tel Aviv and Haifa on the lowland. And, you know, I suppose you and your viewers have heard this notion that Israel, an obstacle of peace, that we don't withdraw to 1967 lines, non-existent borders, to give the poor Palestinians a state. What they don't appreciate, first of all, the Palestinians are not a peace-loving people. They haven't advanced any peace at all. Their sole motivation, and I will come to this and I'll explain it later on, of the proof and evidence of this, is the destruction, stage by stage, of the Jewish state. But how does that mean strategically and geographically? Because as you quite rightly said, about 15, 16 kilometers south of my apartment here are the high grounds of the Shomron Hills.
Which are seen from your kitchen window.
We and my organization have videoed and photographed to show a naive world the absolute vulnerability of the central coastal plain of Israel, which includes Tel Aviv and the sensitive infrastructures, from the high grounds that would be Palestine on 67 borders. And if anything happens in Palestine, whether they continue their terroristic violence to come to the final, what they call the final solution of the Jewish problem in the Middle East, whether it's ruled by any Fatah leader, or even worse, becomes a Hamastan, another Gaza. You will see by some of the photographs that we have taken from this so-called Palestine, overlooking Ben Gurion Airport. And if somebody stands there with a simple RPG rocket and brings down a plane or hits a plane, who's going to fly into Israel tomorrow? Would your people in Sweden want to fly into Israel that had just been bombed from the heights overlooking Ben Gurion Airport?
We would probably the first
Absolutely not.
Withdraw, yes.
Absolutely not. So one has to be informed intelligently of what this stupid notion of a 67-bordered Palestine actually means in real terms. Unfortunately, people are being naively led to believe that peace can only be attained with this end in mind, and it's absolutely untrue.
Barry, you started this passion for this question.
Yes.
You told us that during the 1990s and the Oslo Peace Accords and so forth, well, most people, I presume, were very happy with or they saw it as an optimistic opportunity, maybe, but something happened.
You're quite right, and I have to admit to a mea culpa, because I was a naive peacenik in the good old days.
Okay.
And I trusted the world leaders to deliver us peace. And we agreed to allow a known terrorist who had murdered Israelis and murdered Jews back into the area again because he was exiled in Tunis. His name was Yasser Arafat. And we all clapped when he signed a White House agreement and shook hands with Yitzhak Rabin. And we thought peace at last with the so-called Oslo Accords.
All right.
I didn't know at the time that he went from Washington, D.C. to Johannesburg, South Africa, and gave a speech in a mosque. And he told the audience there, in Arabic, that the Oslo Peace Accords was nothing but the agreement of Habadiyah. This is why the people have to really understand not what Palestinian leaders tell you in Swedish or English, but what they're telling their own people in their own language, because that is where the truth is. The Treaty of Habadiyah was a treaty that Muhammad made with the Jewish people,
the Prophet Muhammad.
Peace be upon him. That he made this agreement knowing that he would tear it up when he could come back with greater forces in order to continue his conquest and murder the Jews. So he tore up this agreement. I just want so people to know the truth of Islamic history. And I would defy anybody who is an expert on Islam to deny what I'm about to say. When he came back and he conquered the Jewish tribes over there, he committed one of the biggest crimes, bigger than ISIS has done. He took 800 Jewish men and boys and he had a mass beheading of 800 Jews there. This was how the Treaty of Habadiyah is treated in Islamic circles. They have an expression called taqiyya, which is acceptable in Islam to deceive the unbelievers. And this is exactly the language that Yasser Arafat used when he got off his plane from Washington, D.C. after signing the Oslo Accords and went there. And we found out that he carried out what he called the Intifada, which is a terror campaign. And that terror campaign came into my hometown here of Netanya.
From where?
From his terrorist and suicide bombers that were being trained and indoctrinated 14, 15 kilometers from here, out of my kitchen window at a place called Tulkarm. Yeah. My wife was almost killed when she was making her way to the shopping mall for the first of 2 suicide bombings that went over there that killed 30 people. We had a suicide bombing at the Park Hotel where Jews had assembled to celebrate Pesach, Passover, which is a festival of redemption and freedom for the Jewish people. And they got blown up while celebrated by another suicide bomber, Palestinian suicide bomber, here from Tulkarm, yes, our near neighbor. I want to tell you, at the time, I and most of the Israelis used to go to Tulkarm. We got there we did our groceries, we bought our house provisions, we brought people from Tulkarm, the Arabs there to do work like the tiling in apartments and things like this. Not anymore when the army went in and had to do something about it. But at the time, what was going on here? And this is why a close friend of mine, Dr. Mordechai Kedar, told me, like I said, I mentioned before, don't listen to what they're telling, Yasser Arafat is telling the BBC in English. Listen to what he's telling his own people in their own language. That's where the truth is. And the truth is, they are bent on destroying Israel because they detest the notion of the Jewish state. It is haram. It is forbidden under Islam. This is what Yasser Arafat told the people, and this is what Mahmoud Abbas is telling his people today.
So you're
unfortunately, because of all this, I became the co-founder of the Netanya Terror Victims Organization. So I know of what I speak.
So you're actually saying that what Yasser Arafat did, what he cheated both his own people and the Jews, Israelis, out of peace, this is something that continues.
You see it on a daily basis. We see it now. I saw a headline today in the newspaper that Mahmoud Abbas is going and wanting some sort of international peace conference. Right. He's not talking about peace conference. What he's talking about is persuading a lot of the naive governments The third world governments, we don't expect much from them.
Yeah.
But the naive European governments, governments like Belgium, like Sweden, like a lot of the European countries who buy this nonsense that he's giving them. He wants his condition, he wants his state, right? He wants his state, he wants Jerusalem as his capital. Why would he want Jerusalem as his capital? He's already got two capitals already. He's got Ramallah, where his presidency is, where his administrative offices are, where their founding hero, Yasser Arafat, is buried. They also have a capital in Gaza City, where the other side of the Palestinian political divide have their reign in the Gaza Strip, Hamas.
Right.
The two don't speak to each other. The two hate each other, and now they want a third capital. I have to tell you a personal story. I was in hospital in Tel Aviv for an operation. When I was covered and I was wheeled back to the ward and I opened my eyes, I found that in the neighbouring bed to me there was a young Arab boy with his mother from Gaza. They had just had a civil war over there where Hamas and Fatah were killing each other. And the Israeli army had to go in there and break it up.
So they had to
and the injured people were in the hospital I was in. And the boy next to me had a bullet that went through his mouth and one went through his body over here. And I understood from him that he was one of the Fatah people who objected to Hamas taking over because they had an election. Shall I tell you, in the only Palestinian elections in 2005, 12 years ago, was their last national election. Should have carried on 4 years, 5 years maximum.
Right.
Mahmoud Abbas is ruling without any democratic association because the people voted for Hamas and they wanted to take over Gaza. Fatah won't let them take over the West Bank, but they wanted to take over there. And you know what they were doing? They were killing the Fatah operatives. They were throwing them off rooftops. They were battling each other. And as I walked round the ward, I found the wards were full of Arabs from the Gaza Strip. Some were Fatah, some were Hamas. The Hamas people who were being treated by Israeli doctors and everything had Israeli security on the gate, on the doors to their wards, in case some of the Fatah people wanted to go in there and kill them.
So let me get this.
So I mean, this is the political divide that's going on right now within the Palestinian Authority. And yet your government is saying, well, we're the obstacle to peace. We should withdraw to 67, have them have part of Jerusalem as their capital, and whatever will be, will be. How naive can they get?
So, Barry, you have written quite extensively about all the aspects of this situation. So you have written 5 books.
Yes.
Could you introduce them to us?
Okay. Well, the first one I wrote was called Israel Reclaiming the Narrative. And I wrote this one because I got so fed up of people telling me or preaching a narrative which was totally untrue. So the subtitle of the book here is Exposing the Big Lie and Their Perpetrators. I wanted to get into the weeds and expose who is telling this nonsense that talks about Israel being an apartheid state, ethnic cleansing, and all these sort of things. And I backed this up with another book that I wrote, which was called, and I don't have any copies right now because it's out of print, but I've got to get more printed over here. But the books are available on Amazon, called BDS for Idiots.
Okay.
All right? The people who profess all the time that they should boycott Israel because of whatever, ethnic cleansing.
BDS, boycott,
divestments and sanctions.
Sanction.
Right. It was started about, they're human rights people. They're really only, doing it in support of the poor Palestinians. And it's the Israelis who are the criminals on this. But if you listen to Omar Barghouti, who is the founder of the BDS movement, he has said quite clearly, the aim of the BDS movement is the annihilation of the Jewish state. That is Omar Barghouti.
And Omar Barghouti studied where?
He studied in Tel Aviv University, which is in Israel, which makes him a total hypocrite.
Right.
But however, the point I make in these books, especially in BDS for Idiots, is, you know, I was 2 or 3 years ago, I was giving a talk in Amsterdam at the Liberal Jewish Center. And I had 3 members of the leading members of BDS movement infiltrate the talk. One of them had a brown shirt, which for me as a Jew, being in Holland at that time, is a very significant colour. Yes. Because they had the brown shirts having the boycotts in Europe during the First World War, Second World War against the Jews. And here's this guy walking in, and he had a sticker here of a Palestinian flag with boycott Israel on. And I gave my 40-minute talk, and then I had questions and answers, and he put his hand up, and I allowed him to speak. And he gave the usual talk about Israel being an apartheid state, ethnic cleansing, all the other cants and nonsense about the illegal occupation of Gaza and oppressing the poor Palestinians.
Right.
And I decided there to actually not talk about Israel, but talk about the things that he was saying. And so this is an interesting exercise, because I said to him, you really support the Palestinians? Yes. And you say, boycott Israel? Yes. So I said, you talk about Israel as apartheid state. I said, do you know where real apartheid is being applied against the Palestinians? Try Jordan. Why Jordan? Because Jordan is a country where about 1.5 million Arabs who profess to be Palestinians have been living in refugee camps for 70 years, since 1948. How can you be in an Arab country like Jordan, be kept in refugee, stateless, most of them not allowed higher education, not allowed government jobs? That is pure apartheid. So I said to the guy in the hall, if you really profess to really support the Palestinians, have you ever demonstrated outside the Jordanian embassy in Holland? Not once. How about ethnic cleansing? You want to know where ethnic cleansing is being applied daily against the Palestinians? Try Syria, who have been barrel bombing refugee camps in Syria. Have you ever protested against the Syrian embassy at The Hague? Not once. But you love the Palestinians. What about the illegal blockade of Gaza? We Jews are supposed to be intelligent people. We know if we had a blockade, legal or illegal, we would know how to operate it. I asked him, I said, tell the audience here, how many trucks a day go into Gaza from Israel? And I waited for a reply. I said, give it your best shot.
He didn't know.
He knew. He didn't want to tell the audience. So I told him. Under the best authority at that time, between 800 and 1,000 trucks a day rolling to Gaza from Israel.
On a daily basis.
How's that for a blockade? I said, but you know where a real blockade is taking place in Gaza? Egypt. How many trucks a day go into Gaza from Egypt? Zippo. How many times, you are a Palestinian lover, how many times have you protested to the Egyptian government in Holland about their blockade, legal or otherwise? Not once. So I said, the three issues, the BDS main messages about ethnic cleansing, apartheid, illegal blockade, when it applies to the other countries, they're silent. In other words, I told you, you're a hypocrite. And you're not only a hypocrite, you're an anti-Semite. Because the one country you protest against, wrongly, factually wrong, is the Jewish state. And that, for me, makes you an anti-Semite. And then I turned to the audience And I said, what I've just given you is common sense and simple facts. And you Jews of Holland are the ones who should be speaking up and condemning and challenging these lies against Israel, whether it's from the BDS or from your politicians or from your media, and you are silent. I said, I'm speaking to you here in the Anne Frank Hall, and I have a feeling that I am in Europe of the 1930s, where the Jews were silent then and you are silent today. Then they were picking on the individual Jews. Now they are picking on the collective Jews, but it's the same Jew hatred behind it all. And that's why I wrote the book, the other book here, the Black Book, Fighting Hamas, BDS and anti-Semitism, because people are operating anti-Semitism where they deny I am not a anti-Semite, like the Swedish foreign minister, for instance, where the only country she condemns in the world is the Jewish state, and has nothing much to say about Syria, Iraq or the other. And the Swedish government are leading the protests in the United Nations and the European Union against one country, Israel, and giving the Palestinian terrorists a free pass. That is the anti-Semitism and the hate that I argue about. And this is the message you do not get in Sweden, because your media won't cover it and your politicians won't cover it with the truth. But I'm hitting here, being the co-founder of the Netanya Terror Victims Organization, to tell you people the truth of what is going on and stop the hypocrisy and the lies and the silence of your governments and your media.
So you're traveling the world with this fantastic message that you have and information. You wrote some more books, but when you do this, when you do presentations and such like, do you get feedback?
Very much so.
And what type of feedback is that? Is it
I've had to open now about, for instance, one of the easy ways to get a message out is Facebook. And I'm going to say this, I'm going to have people protesting to Facebook to close me down. I've just come out of Facebook prison for 30 days for telling the truth.
Welcome back.
So, but I'll take this up. So, you know, we'll open up other Facebook pages. But we have about 40, some in my name, some other names, where I give the information over there, because it's vitally important. I think it's vitally important that people get the message of the truth or the reality. I believe in real politics. I used to believe in fantasy politics, right? Before I came to before actually the reality of life came with Palestinian car bombs and suicide bombers in my town here in Netanya. And it's always our fault, right? You know, somebody once told me that if you're a socialist up to the age of 30, you haven't got a heart. But I'm here to tell you, if you're a socialist over the age of 30, you haven't got a head. Okay. Because you can't exist, you can't run your country and your world out of a naive vision of some utopian future. Because there are too many people with evil intent to take advantage of your naivety. Right. Both externally and internally. And I see this happening country after country in Europe. Yes, so
anti-Semitism is on the rise in the name of anti-Israelism, and you actually wrote more books.
Yeah.
Yes, so your fourth book, I think, is this one, 1917.
I wrote this book last year, 1917, From Palestine to the Land of Israel. I wrote this because 1917 for Israel and the Jewish state and the birth of the Jewish state was a very significant year. And last year there were a number of major 100-year anniversary celebrations going on over here. And I felt it was about time to give a real historic perspective of what happened over there, because what happened at that time really affected what has happened since. And I think, you know, sometimes I say, sorry, we Jews tend to be a bit arrogant. We say, you know, look what we achieved, we did it all and everything. Yeah. But I think there's a time to be a little bit modest and real about things. And what happened at the time was that I acknowledge in the book what I call the extraordinary early struggles of Jewish and Christian heroes to establish the State of Israel. At that time, this area wasn't Israel. There wasn't a Palestinian entity. It was, prior to 1917, a backwater, a barren place belonging to the Ottoman Empire. It was a district of Greater Syria, an empty place. There were commercial centres in Haifa and the port of Haifa and Jaffa. Jerusalem had a Jewish majority. But around the land there were Bedouins with their flocks and sheep and goats and camels and everything, and some Arab workers working the land. But by the turn of the century, the Jews were coming into the land, mainly from Europe, to escape the anti-Semitism, the pogroms of Russia, and started to develop the land on a collective basis, right, an open industry. And what happened then is that the Arabs started coming in from the surrounding areas to take advantage of the work offered to them by the what's called the Zionist enterprise at the time, or in the factories or in the industries or the land, to help or give services to the Jewish enterprise. And basically, they were economic migrants, like you have today, basically, right? Refugees, they come to find employment and work and whatever, which is fine. They didn't come to reclaim any land. They didn't come to claim any Palestinian state that they had lost many years ago, or they had 450 years under the Ottoman Empire to either negotiate or claim Palestinian state, and nobody ever did. The Jews have an inherent history going back 2,000, 3,000 years, that prior to being given the name Palestine by a Roman emperor on the ruins of Israel, the state of Israel, Jews always had this prayer that they prayed daily, pay at all their festivals, including the Passover we talked about, Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem.
Which is still said today.
Which is obviously still today, but it's been said when the Jews were in exile throughout the world in the diaspora for 3,000 years. It's a fact that Jerusalem was built by King Solomon and King David, undeniable. Well, I'm sorry, I'll take that back. It is now deniable, because certain governments, like the Swedish government, have colluded with the UNESCO to say that Jerusalem is an Islamic holy place. Oh, and maybe okay for the Christians as well, because Jesus was there,
think UNESCO
with no mention of the Jews.
Has to...
So this denial is going on today, but we Jews know the truth. And what I appeal to the ordinary person who's watching this video is just be honest and take the truth, because your leaders are being seduced in a corrupted and cynical political manner. And this book brings out the truth. And the acknowledgement I wanted to make was that a window opened up, because the greatest power at that time was not America, it was Britain. And if it hadn't been for a Welsh Baptist and a Scottish Presbyterian, there's a grave doubt whether Israel would have been a state. Because the Welsh Baptist, his name was David Lloyd George, man of Welsh origin, born in Manchester where I was born, who became the Prime Minister. And he invited a Scottish Presbyterian by the name of Arthur Balfour to be his Foreign Secretary. These people were raised from childhood in Victorian Britain on the understanding of their religion and faith, which believed in the redemption of the Jewish people to their home in Zion. They were corroborating what I just told you. Right? They were born on the hymns of the Wesley brothers, John and Charles. Their psalms talk about the return of the Jewish people to Zion, and the Messiah wouldn't come until this was achieved.
Yeah.
Lloyd George said, don't forget, this was a time of the First World War, where Britain was losing badly on the Western Front. He met Chaim Weizmann, who was a leader of the Zionist movement in Great Britain, and he told him, Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, that he knew the name places and the locations of the biblical battles better than he knew where the British were fighting in France on the Western Front, because it came from his childhood. And he felt both politically, for Britain's interest, that they would have to open a new campaign in Palestine to defeat the Germans and the Turks that were allied against the British.
Yes.
And he opened up this front in Palestine under General Allenby. And he gave General Allenby an instruction. I want you to give the British people a present. Take Jerusalem before Christmas. But he knew in his heart this, and he told Chaim Weizmann that this would lead to the redemption of the Jewish people and the restoration of the Jewish people to their national home in Palestine. And Lord Balfour instructed Chaim Weizmann to draft a letter that he would make British policy. And that letter became known as the Balfour Declaration, where it says, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of the national home of the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the fulfilment of this object. Now, this was, and as a result of the Balfour Declaration, what happened was after the First World War, and the defeat of the Turks here in Palestine, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and there was a vacuum over here.
Yeah.
And the United Nations at that time, the League of Nations, met to decide what to do with the whole of the Middle East. And they decided to appoint various mandates. One for Iraq, which was called Mesopotamia, another one for Syria, another one for the other regions, and one for Palestine. There was one also for Austria and Hungary, because they were part of this. But the mandate for Palestine, which was given to the British to govern, was the only mandate which stipulated for whom that mandate is intended for.
And?
It's the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. When they talked about Syria, they didn't talk about for whom, not for the Syrian people, not for the Iraqi people in Mesopotamia. The only mandate at that time was mandated for the establishment of the national home of the Jewish people. And it stipulated that the Jewish homeland must protect the minorities to give them equal or full religious and civil rights, which Israel has done to this day. We'll come to that in a minute. I want to want one other rider here. Now, people may object, well, you forgot about the Palestinians. First of all, there was never a Palestinian state. There was never any Palestinian ruler or whatever. But yes, the Palestinians had not been ignored, because Chaim Weizmann had made an agreement with Emir Faisal called the Faisal-Weizmann Treaty, in which Faisal expected to be made the king of Syria. Right? And he wasn't, because the French objected to it. Not because the Jews objected to it, the French objected to it. So instead they made him virtually the king of Iraq, right? And he had a brother called Abdullah. But what about Palestine? Well, what Winston Churchill did was said to the Zionists, the Jews, well, your state will stop at the Jordan River virtually, and across the other side of the Jordan River, we're giving this to Abdullah, Faisal's brother. And that, if you look on the map at the time, that was Palestine, which is now called Jordan. And today in Jordan, 80% of the Jordanians, including the 1.5 million Arabs in refugee camps, consider themselves Palestinian. I've got news for you. The wife of the current King Abdullah, the Hashemite king of Jordan, is a Palestinian. Now, there are some people who say today, two-state solution. I belong in a small, fairly influential people forum, closed-door forum, where we have various what we call alternatives to a failed two-state solution, because it will fail. It will fail.
So you don't believe that it will be possible in the future to create this two-state?
Nothing to do with us, because we have made peace deals where people thought it was impossible with Jordan. It still holds today.
Yes.
Another one with Egypt. Despite the Egyptian people themselves are some of the biggest anti-Semites in the world, right? We still have a peace treaty that lasts. We have had successive Israeli prime ministers who have put out their hand to the Palestinians and say, make peace, but you have to compromise and you have to recognize and acknowledge you will be a neighbor of the Jewish state of Israel, and they refuse to do so. There isn't a complete Palestinian entity to make peace with. It has always been divided. When they're not hating us, they're killing each other. So we would want peace. And the emphasis of your government ought to be, prove to us that you can convert these Palestinians, whether it's the ones in Ramallah and the ones of Hamas, to be genuine peacemakers. And then the Israeli public may be interested to making the dangerous concessions that we have started to make up till now, because we've been pressured to do it, and we're in a far more vulnerable situation now because of it. Just look what happened when we were being attacked from Lebanon, and we withdrew from Lebanon. Today, Hezbollah is in virtually ruling the Lebanese government, and there are 160,000 sophisticated, lethal, accurate weapons aimed at us from Lebanon. We withdraw from the Gaza Strip, and everybody told us they would be given their protection. Now we have Hamas and Islamic Jihad and even ISIS in the Gaza Strip. Only the other day they were firing rockets at us from there. Now we've got Iran on our border with Syria, on the Golan Heights. You're asking us to take another step and withdraw to, what did you say, 16 kilometers from my house over here? That it's going to become another Hamastan? Forget it. So, in this forum, one of the many alternatives is there is no choice in the future. We can be tolerant, we can be as patient as the Arabs can be, while the Europeans and the other foolish governments get their act together to produce for us the adversary, to prove to us they are genuinely for peace, right? But if not, we will carry on protecting ourselves. In the meantime, an alternative, one of the alternatives, and if people are facing the facts, that Jordan is today, basically, based on the democratics, Palestine. It was then. It could be called that today. So if Mahmoud Abbas wants his third capital, apart from Gaza City and Ramallah, his third capital can be Amman, Jordan. 80% of the population there think themselves Palestinian. Why not? Look to the east instead of to the west if he has this ambition.
Now, you have continued and you have written another book as well.
Yes.
And I would like you to talk about this book. It's a more on a personal note. I mean, it's not, this is kind of a history book, but now you've sort of changed. Well, and you took true history and made it something else. So could you tell us what it is?
When I do research, I came across some of the characters. I mentioned to you that in this book, I want to tell you, in this book there were some other Christians who became Zionists at the time, some British officers.
Serving
in the book 1917.
Yeah, right.
Can I mention one before I come on to this book?
Course.
All right. There was one man with an exceptional story. His name was Colonel John Patterson. He has a colourful history. He was a British officer. He served in Africa. This is going back 1917 and even before, 1914. They made a movie of him. He was an exceptional character. He killed some man-eating lions who were attacking some of the Indian workers the British Army had working in Africa, and he shot the lions. He also had an affair with a young bride whose apparently husband committed suicide while he was taking them on safari, and he was sent home in shame, and there was even question raised in House of Parliament about his behaviour. So he was confined to Whitehall to do some pen pushing. And at the time, a Palestinian Jew, a Russian Jew called Zeb Jabotinsky, was banging on the doors of the British General Staff in Egypt and then to Whitehall because he had recruited Jewish refugees. What had happened prior to the First World War is the Turks, who controlled Palestine among other places, were led by a man called this Jamal Pasha, who deported 15,000 Palestinian Jews from Palestine, kicked them out of Palestine. They were put on boats and they sailed to refugee camps in Egypt, where this Russian journalist, Zev Jabotinsky, found them. And he started training them and told them, you are going to be the first Jewish fighting force that will enter Palestine, our ancient land of Israel, to liberate the land. And he said, I am going to persuade the British to recruit you into the British Army. An incredible story. This is true. You could look it up in history. And it was accepted that there would be a Jewish fighting force. By the British. Lord Derby, the war minister in the First World War, decided before you go into Palestine, you have to go and fight in Gallipoli, in the Dardanelles for Britain, against the Turks over there. And depending on your conduct, we'll decide what to do with you. Maybe if you're good, then if we open up a Palestinian campaign, they didn't have a Palestine. They were in Egypt, but there as a protector. Yeah. Right? They had tried to attack Gaza twice and lost. But he said, if so, first we'll go over there. And to be what they called the Zion Mule Corps, they had to pull donkeys from the beach with ammunition, take them up to the front line and bring back the wounded. And they had to find a British officer to lead them. And so they found this man who had been in disgrace, John Patterson, and said, you will be the commander of this fighting force, this Jewish fighting force. And in this book, the 1917, From Palestine to the Land of Israel, I quote here John Patterson, and he wrote in his memoirs, I was amazed when I was recruited by General Maxwell to lead a Jewish fighting force. He didn't know about my religious upbringing as a Christian, where I believed in the redemption of the Jewish people. He said, I didn't get my instructions from General Maxwell. I felt I got my instructions from God himself, because I was going to become the first commander of a Jewish fighting force for 2,000 years and lead this fighting force to liberate what had been the ancient land of the Jewish people. I mean, isn't that amazing? It's like a miracle, in a sense. And in fact, he led them in Gallipoli, and he brought them back. And Lord Derby said, you have conducted yourself with commendable courage. You will become the Jewish Legion, and we will recruit you into the Royal Fusiliers. And they fought in Palestine under John Patterson. I want to end this little story about John Patterson, because when I talk to audiences, I ask anybody if anybody knows a Christian British officer who is buried in a Jewish cemetery here in Israel.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? And it's an amazing story because he died, after the war, he went to live in America. And he was very friendly with Jabotinsky, who was in America also rallying for the Zionist cause, because Jabotinsky had been one of his officers under him. And through that, he met a man who was Jabotinsky's secretary. The man's name was Benjamin Netanyahu, who was the secretary of Zeb Jabotinsky. So when John Patterson, before he died, he told his children, his grandchildren, he would love to be buried alongside his soldiers who had fought so well. But he died and he was buried, and his wife was buried in California. But his grandson was very insistent. And he tried to find, against all odds, a way in which his father could be reinterred somewhere in Israel. And his message came to the attention of the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, right? Who was the son of Ben-Zion Netanyahu. And the connection was that Ben-Zion Netanyahu was also a personal friend of John Patterson. And when Benjamin Netanyahu's first son was born, he invited the Christian, John Patterson, to be one of the godfathers. And they named the son Jonathan. John for John Patterson, and Nathan for Nathan, his Ben-Zion's wife's father. And he came to the Brit Milah, which is the Jewish christening, if you want to call it that. And he gave his godchild a silver Jewish Kiddush cup, a drinking cup.
Yeah.
So the connection was there, and Benjamin Netanyahu knew this story personally. And Benjamin Netanyahu made the arrangement that the remains of John Patterson and his wife be flown to Israel, and he lies, you can visit their graves in the Jewish cemetery at Avichai, where he lies next to the Jewish soldiers of the Jewish Legion that he led at that time. It's an incredible story. So, but coming on to the book you told me about, this book, sometimes my wife is right about a few issues, and she told me that I'll never make a fortune writing these historic documentary and non-fiction books. I have to write a sloppy sort of romance. So in the research I did, I discovered that during the First World War, helping the British here in Palestine was a large network of volunteers, Palestinian Jews, who sacrificed themselves to supply the British with the vital intelligence they needed to plan their Palestine campaign. It was started by a man called Aronson, who, as part of his career, became an intelligence officer linked to the British intelligence in Egypt. And he had set up a major spy ring called the Nili spy ring. And because he was in Egypt, he had needed somebody to lead it. And the person he chose to lead it, actually she insisted to lead it, is his sister, a younger sister called Sarah Aronson. Sarah Aronson became the only woman to lead a major espionage network in enemy territory under enemy noses during wartime ever. She was 24, 26 years old. She was very attractive. She'd had a passionate affair with a romantic figure whose fate you'll have to read about in the book. For some reason, again, you have to read the book to find out why she left Palestine.
Yes.
Zichron Yaakov, she lived, for Constantinople. When the war started, she felt she had to come back. And she found an escort to bring her back. And on her tortuous journey back, she witnessed the genocide of the Christian Armenians at the hands of the Turks. And she came back here and she reported to her brother what they're doing to the Christian Armenians, they are going to do to the Jews in Palestine. He had to go to Egypt. She took over the network. She had 40 to 50 operators giving the British the information and the intelligence that General Allenby admitted without that information he could never have won the campaign.
So we're talking about a major figure.
But actually I've written this book as a debut novel, and the people who read it say to me, ask me, is it true? And it's a fiction. But it can't be true. It's too amazing to be true. And I just give them a nod. The thing about this book, by the way, there are now sort of outreaches to Hollywood, to screenwriters and the movie company, because I have to tell you, I have to admit this, as I was writing this book, because I've never written a novel before, I was visualizing as if I was watching a movie as I was writing the scenes and the dialogue. And as I was visualizing this, in my mind, I began to see the actress playing the role of this young, beautiful Jewish heroine. Guess who it is? The only one that's absolutely perfect for this role. Wonder Woman, Gal Gadot.
The real Wonder Woman.
The real Wonder Woman. This isn't a fiction. I mean, the movie would look like an amazing fiction.
Yes.
But the screen credits will tell you this is a real person. And what I wrote about here was true events and real events. And the response I'm getting from this is amazing. But it's another part of our history.
So this book talks about the beginning of the would-be state of Israel and what they had to go through.
Without these sort of people, without the known heroes, and also without some of the little-known heroes, there wouldn't be an Israel today. I have another moment of criticism, and I speak about this in certain meetings. I had a meeting in Jerusalem, what's called the Jewish Historical Society of England, where I raised the question here, and I referred to the Balfour Declaration, which became British policy right at the time. And I just one little sentence of this, that His Majesty government flew with favour in Palestine, the national home for the Jewish people, and used their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. And I raised a question, sorry, did the British actually use their best endeavours? And this book is full of the information that the British officers that came to govern Palestine prior to the mandate and up to the mandate from Cairo and from Jerusalem were some of the biggest anti-Semites in the British military and civil administration. One of their popular readings was an infamous book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Yes. Even Chaim Weizmann found out that this was true when he came to visit Allenby and Ramla. And I name names in this book, and there are one or two British characters over here who were the ones who stoked up some of the Arab leaders at the time to protest their own British policy of allowing a Jewish national home to be developed over here. And the start of that outbreak was the Arabs and the Muslims have a annual festival, which was called the Nebi Musa Festival. And it's usually with drum beats and dancing and things like this. But one of the British officers colluded with an Arab rabble-rouser by the name of Haj Amin al-Husseini. And when the Arabs assembled in Jerusalem, they started talking about we have to protest, we have to protest violently, go out and death to the Jews, and they went into the old city on a 3-day rampage. And the British controlled the entrances because the British were still there, this is in 1920, would not allow people in, apart from the people participating in the Nebi Musa Festival, and wouldn't let people out. not even the Jews that were being slaughtered, raped, and having their property destroyed. Eventually, when this protest reached, the British had to stop the riots. Jews were dead, women had been raped, properties had been killed, and they went on to try and arrest people. Haj Amin al-Husseini ran away. They caught some of the Arab rapists. They went searching for weapons. In the time, the Zev Jabotinsky, who had been a British officer and had been demobbed, had gone to Sir Ronald Storrs, who was the governor of Jerusalem at the time, to try and allow him to put his self-defense force to go into the old city to stop it and protect the Jews over there, and Ronald Storrs didn't agree. But after it, he sent some of the British military police to go searching in the homes of some of the Jews who had been parts of the British army and were demobbed looking for weapons. And in Jabotinsky's house they found 2 pistols and 3 rifles. And they arrested him. And they put him on trial for possessing illegal weapons. And he got sentenced to 15 years in prison. Haj Amin al-Husseini, who started the riots, got sentenced to 10 years.
And what happened?
The rapist got sentenced to 15 years. And there was a huge protest. Global protest. So much so that the British had to rescind the sentence of Jabotinsky, and they deported him from Palestine, never to return. Didn't kill anybody with these guns. They found at his home the guns. They released the rapist, and they also rescinded the sentence of Haj Amin al-Husseini. This is the even-handedness of the British. Incidentally, as a final thing, our friend Haj Amin al-Husseini was later to sit at the feet of Adolf Hitler in Berlin.
Yes.
At the outbreak of the Second World War, to plan, as they put it, the final solution of the Jewish problem in the Middle East, in Palestine. And this was supposed to be the first Palestinian leader who was more bent on killing Jews than creating a Palestine. Even he didn't want to create a Palestine because he was still in support originally of having Emir Faisal be the king of Syria, which he was hoping would include all of Palestine anyway. So you can see this is part of history at the time, that even this person who was leading the riots to killing the Jews at that time, and it was followed up by another pogrom in Hebron in 1926, where another 37 Jews, no more, 37 I think was the number of Jews that were killed there as well. The obsession was more of killing Jews than creating a peaceful state alongside the Jewish state of Israel. And that default, this defect in the psyche is going on today. And it is that is preventing peace today, nothing that Israel does or doesn't do. And that is the message that has to go across to a lot of the readers, including the European readers. There's a lot of truth in history that is very relevant today.
So European governments, or let's talk about the Swedish government, because that's we're having a Swedish crew here today. So does it have to do with, what do you think? Does it have to do with anti-Semitism, or is it just being very politically correct, so to speak, or are they just completely naive?
First of all, there's no such thing as politically correct. Whenever I hear that, I know it's the most incorrect thing, an obscene thing ever. I think it's cynical politics. Yeah. I think it's cynical externally and internally. I think they feel that they have to schmooze up the Arab world or whatever in order to do business with them and commerce with them. I want to hear to tell them that, quite frankly, you know, if they supported Israel, they would still do business with the Arabs, because we're finding ourselves as a realignment going on here. But it's also to do with internal things, because politicians are interested in one thing, and that is keeping their backside in the highest chair they can get. And so they're trying to appeal to the local constituency, which is growing in a lot of European countries, to people who are, quite frankly, hate Israel and are anti-Semitic by birth. That I'm not saying that Swedish politicians are anti-Semitic. God forbid. But they're catering to their constituency.
Right. Okay.
That's a cynical truth. Sorry to be so truthful, but that's real politics. And we know where you're coming from, and we know why you're doing it, but we're not going to surrender to all the threats and the pressures you're putting up to. We simply want to say, look where the truth is, and if you want peace, genuinely want peace, try and deal with the other side. We've been trying to deal with them for 100 years, and we're getting nowhere.
Barry, so you don't only write books, you do other things as well.
Yep.
So could you tell us a little bit about the things that you're doing? I know that you're involved in sports and anti-Semitism.
Yep.
And you're involved in, you're around the world giving lectures about all the subject that we've been talking about. So could you, please?
Yeah, I also, there's a lot of organizations from abroad or groups who, when they're coming to Israel, they want somebody to explain the perspective from Israel of what's going on, because, and I find increasingly when they come, they're totally unaware of the reality of life over here and the truth of what's going over here, whether they don't get it from their media or from the politicians, something like this. But people who know me via the social media, it's Facebook or LinkedIn or things like that, know I put on videos and I write articles or whatever, but then I get invited from time to time abroad by different organizations, Christian organizations and Jewish organizations, sometimes academic organizations, to attend conferences or to give talks to their audiences. And I would gladly go, because I think it's vitally important that more and more people get the truth and the information of what's going on over here.
And when you go on a lecture, or when you give lectures, what is the response? If you could sort of generalize the response, is it a surprise? Are they anti your talk, or are they?
No, actually, the response I get from people after the talk is, "Wow, we never knew that." And I give them the information, ask them to do the research, go and do the Google and find out what everything I told them, whether it's true or not. And I have to say this, I go to certain places and people come up to me and say, well, why aren't we getting this information? I said, well, maybe your media doesn't want to put it out because they're politically correct. And they said, well, why aren't we getting it from the Israeli government? So I said, quite right, because I'm also critical of the Israeli government. I want to tell you, I think one of the things that the Israeli government don't do, especially the foreign ministry, is I don't believe there's anywhere in any Israeli embassy anywhere in the world that has somebody who is trained in what I call public diplomacy. I'm not talking about diplomatic diplomacy, because they're very interested in keeping good contacts with government level, but a lot of where the battles are taking place is on a lower level. It's street level, it's in the schools, it's in the academics, it's at the group level. And I think for that you need what I call public diplomacy or person-to-person diplomacy. And what the Israeli government has failed to do is to respond to the attacks that's going on against Israel, which is usually filled with lies and allegations and emotional imagery. And I think it's very important for the Israeli government to train people to be in embassies, to work with local grassroots organizations and to help them and give them the information that I put out, but they don't do it. So it takes volunteers like me to have to do it. And part of the result of that, if I take Great Britain, for instance, one of the things that I've seen at local level is people are so offended by the assaults on Israel and the anti-Semitism that accompanies it, that people at grassroots level, both Christian and Jewish, create their organizations. And there's a network of independent groups around in England, like Northwest Friends of Israel and Sussex Friends of Israel and Essex Friends of Israel and Liverpool Friends of Israel. It's local people getting together. And I do my best to supply them with the information. They feed me the things that are being fed to them, and how do we answer this? And I give them the information. A close friend of mine, a man I personally admire, is a guy called Nigel Goodrich. And he got involved because he was walking through Glasgow one day when he found a demonstration of about 6 or 8 people chanting outside a store in Glasgow selling Dead Sea products.
Okay.
And 1 or 2 with Palestinian flags. What's this going on? And he spoke to the store and says, it happens every week. These people come at weekend and make their life miserable. And he decided, where can I get information to rival, to tell people the truth about Israel?
Yeah.
Didn't get anything from the Israeli embassy. He got the information from an organisation called Stand With Us, and they gave him the information. So he went along with a friend of his and set up a little table and sat there.
Outside
and people
the
were
store.
going by outside, just along the street from the store,
Yeah.
where the people were walking past this, running the gauntlet of these anti-Israel haters. And he started handing over these leaflets and saying, read the truth about Israel. And he started a group called Glasgow Friends of Israel. And he spoke to other friends. And now today, there are, I think, 14 groups of Friends of Israel in different locations in Scotland. He's combined them together with something called COFIS, a Coalition of Friends of Israel Scotland. And this Christian guy, who was a very close friend, I admire him tremendously, decided a few years ago to put on a festival in Edinburgh where they have the Fringe Festival, a cultural festival.
Yeah.
And he called it the International Shalom Festival. And he brought over artists, musicians and dancers and artists from Israel. Jews, Christian, Bedouin, Aramean, these sort of people to perform over there. And the BDS in Scotland mounted a campaign costing lots of money, a very sophisticated hate campaign where they tried to close it down. And the people attending it had to run the gauntlet. But he persisted. Out of his own pocket, he put this festival together and it was successful. He did it the year after. But this time he got the help of the Provost of Edinburgh and also of the police, and there was less of a BDS protest, and that one was also successful. This is a private initiative. But these sort of people who go out and do this sort of thing need to be helped.
Yeah.
And the Israeli government wrongly thinks it's some sort of stigma that if the Israeli government helps people who are there promoting the truth about Israel, they shouldn't do it. Why shouldn't they do it? If the Palestinian Authority and their haters from other places are giving untold money to organizations like BDS or the student organizations who hate Israel, why is it not legitimate to Israel to hold their head high and say, we will tell you the truth of Israel? So I think this is part of the things that we do, and we're winning friends all the time.
And you also mentioned, while we were talking here, FIFA, which is a huge organization.
Yes.
It's got a huge impact on people. I mean, football is across borders. Football doesn't have any limit. Could you tell us about that, please?
People may be familiar that FIFA have had a campaign that's going on for about 10 years now. I think they've spent certainly in excess of $12 million on a campaign of kick racism out of football. It's quite right, because a lot of people, football clubs or people were upset where, for instance, black football players were being insulted by other players or by the crowd, and they wanted to stamp this down.
Yeah.
And it's good that they do it, and it's a very positive thing. There's a recent thing that's come on, and in Britain in particular, where some football teams, Chelsea in particular, for instance, mounted a campaign of kick anti-Semitism out of football because some of their supporters were coming out with very anti-Semitic chants and everything. And I was pleased to see a picture of one of their star players of Chelsea, like Eden Hazard and Ross Barkley, standing with a banner, kick anti-Semitism out of football. I think that's very good. But the thing that we've been involved in here is writing the record of the connection of terrorism to football that has been taking place for about 10, 15, 20 years by the Palestinian Football Association, who have football events, sporting events, cultural events named after Palestinian terrorists. Palestinians who've gone out and killed hundreds of Israelis. And they do it in the name of sport. It's kids' sports, it's children's football, it's girls' table tennis, and it comes into their Palestinian Football Association events named after Abu Jihad, for instance. They have tournaments every year named Abu Jihad, right? They had a tournament or a photo op of the Al-Hilal Al-Quds football team, which is the Palestinian champion football team, and there's a photograph which shows their team and their management on the football pitch with a big sign with a picture of a terrorist who had murdered some people in Jerusalem the weeks before, calling him a hero and a martyr. I make the equivalent of this. It was almost as if the Chelsea Football Club had gone onto the ground in front of their fans at Stamford Bridge Football Stadium with the banner of the terrorist that murdered people in London Bridge fairly recently, calling him a hero and martyr. It's the same equivalent. If they had done that, I guess there would have been protest. But we have been lobbying for 2 years now, FIFA, to cut terrorism out of football, and they're doing nothing about it. And we have presented them with legal briefs drawn up by the legal representative of Palestine Media Watch, by the legal representative of UK Lawyers for Israel, by the legal representative of the Lawfare Project in New York, and by myself on behalf of the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies. And we have the backing of the One Family Terror Victims Organization in Jerusalem, here in Israel. And yet FIFA aren't doing anything about it. So, and we are demanding that FIFA cut the incitement to terrorism out of football and take punishable measures according to their code of ethics that is taking place in the Palestinian Football Association under the chairmanship of Jibril Rajoub, to cut this hate and the incitement that leads to violence. And we have documented how a captain of a football team went out and murdered a girl, 19-year-old girl, outside the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. And we have fans who have been incited by this and gone out in stabbing attacks against people over here. This incitement to violence and to terrorism has to stop, and it's been doing in the name of football. FIFA have a direct responsibility to cut this out.
So this is a campaign that's 2 years old and still going strong, I understand.
All we have is our legal briefs and our protests and letters that have been signed by terror victims over here. A simple acknowledgement: we have received your correspondence. We'll be dealt with in due course. Not good enough. Okay. FIFA has a responsibility. They're right about cutting racism out of sport. They're right to support a campaign about cutting anti-Semitism out of sport. And if they're right, certainly killing people and inciting to kill people in sport, which is being perpetrated close to here, that has to be dealt with as well. It's against all rules of ethics and decency.
Yes, of course. That's almost redundant, yes. So, Barry, when you're out lecturing, you meet all kinds of people from all faiths and all, also people without the faith. You mentioned something about great supporters that help you with this. Could you tell us about that, please?
Yeah. I travel abroad. I talk in synagogues and halls to Jewish audiences. They're very receptive. But I want to say the most enthusiastic supporters I get, both there and of the groups that are coming here again, are the Christian supporters of Israel are absolutely phenomenal. I find their enthusiasm and their thirst for information and knowledge is incredible. They are self-educated, if you want to do with Israel, because it comes from, as I mentioned before, it comes from their belief. They know about the Bible. They believe in the Bible. They come here on pilgrimage to visit the places that are important to them. So they also want to add, and they tell me all the time how much they bless Israel and pray for Israel. And I always tell them, sort of jokingly, God tells you have to do more than pray for Israel. God, if you read the Old Testament, doesn't tell you to pray, it tells you to do things. Yes. So you have to go out and do things for Israel. So they're very appreciative of the perspective that I give them, and they take it back, and I get feedback from them. Yeah. I always tell them, if you go back and you find something you don't know how to cope with or you don't know how to answer, tell me what it is, and I'll send you the information, and use it. But please use it, because you have to go out and be an ambassador. You can't, I don't want you to simply be a fan of Israel. I want you to be an advocate for Israel. It's part of what you should do. And I want to say these people are the most enthusiastic and the most openly, unquestioning friends of Israel. I find some of the Jewish people are questioning and critical friends, which is fine. Then I have to answer some of the criticism because I put it in the perspective. Yeah. It's more of a challenge than with the Christians, and I love meeting with them and talking with them and helping them.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear. Thank you. Barry Shaw, I thank you very much for this interview.
My pleasure.
And keep it going.
I will.
Yeah.